If I told you every American president had to kill 100 babies in order for our society to function as it does, what would you say? Would that be acceptable? How would you stop it? I'm not asking these questions idly. I'm asking these questions because I believe that in order for this moment to serve as a catalyst, in order for us to use this moment as a launch pad to a better future, it's going to require us to ask some hard questions, to sit with some hard truth. The reality is that we're seeing ideologies of domination like capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy, patriarchy shift their tactics because they're so used to relying on obscurity and obfuscation. They draw strength from those things. And those things have been diminished over the last few years. More people are not only aware that these ideologies exist, but see their material impact on our real lives. So they can't hide in the shadows and operate in the shadows like they typically do. So now, instead of relying on those shadows, they're relying on explicit bigotry, on suppression of ideas, on brute force, right? And I suspect that after years of this administration's worsening policies, the policies that will worsen people's material condition, when it's time for a new election, people will be hungry for something different and will have an opportunity to really push past our norms and boundaries, especially because so many people now realize we are not as far as a country as people thought we were before this previous election. So people will be more open to demanding more since they've gotten less, and they realize that now. But before we can get there, right, we're going to have to build up some infrastructure in the intervening years. We're going to have some mutual aid networks, some survival skills, some political education. We're going to have to be so connected to one another that we can completely divest from the system and escalate our demands when they are not responsive to the changes we're trying to push past, to the fundamental transformations that we're demanding, right? But before we get there, I think we have to sit with and interrogate what it means as a country and as a part of the Western empire, Western hegemony, Western imperialism. We're going to have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a country with a legacy of human enslavement, where we had millions of people who suffered under some of the most brutal and inhumane conditions ever known to this earth? And then that was followed by 100 years of social exclusion and violence and dehumanization, right? And that was built on the eradication of whole societies and civilizations that had their own religious practices and values and norms and food practices and connections, such that we don't even acknowledge that they had to be completely stripped from this land in order for us to inhabit it. We go through our day-to-day without that thought even crossing our minds normally, right? And then we built on those legacies with our incarceration practices, with how we treat the poor, and now with our consumer practices. Like so many of the items we rely on in our day-to-day practices require human suffering in one form or another, either through prison labor or through the extraction of resources in other countries or through sweatshops in other countries, so forth and so on, right? And we come from generations of people who've looked the other way as long as it wasn't them, without interrogating how that alters and shifts your own political systems, social systems, economic systems, education systems, right? Because if people don't have if our politicians and leaders historically have had no problem with a Hiroshima, right, with a Gaza or with a Palestine, with the things they've done in the global South, if they don't have any problem slaughtering whole populations of people, why do you think they'd have a problem stealing your tax dollars? Why do you think they'd have a problem manipulating your elections? Why do you think they'd have a problem saturating your education system with propaganda? Once you normalize the degree of human suffering that we've seen at a collective scale in this globe, everything else pales in comparison. Nothing is a red line anymore. And while the worst of it we can locate somewhere else, those norms and the precedent that sets affects how our politics operate here too. because the sense of morality and right and wrong is so distorted that now they can justify harmful actions here too, especially if they are to a lesser degree than the harm that's being perpetuated elsewhere. We are told that the harm we experience, we are lucky to only experience as much as we do. So then we normalize the suffering as well, because the suffering is normalized in our media, in our entertainment, in our education, and so forth and so on. We're heralded as the heroes for what we did in Hiroshima, right? And so I want us to begin to sit with how we too reflect those norms, reflect those values, reflect that normalization and desensitization to human suffering. Because before we can transform those norms in our politics and in our education and in our economics, we must first have to transform those norms in ourselves. We must first have to interrogate where they find voice in ourselves. And if instead what we do out of anger and frustration and hopelessness or apathy is decide that the problem is somewhere else, that the problem is with the other side of the aisle, that the problem is with the other races, that the problem is with the other gender, that the problem is with the other ideologies, and that we could never be part of the problem, then we also locate the solution somewhere else. And we absolve ourselves of having to do anything. And the reality is that none of these things change unless we do. In fact, I would argue that our ability to effectuate change externally is directly proportional to our willingness to change internally, to our willingness to ask ourselves how we reflect the things we don't like and what we're willing to sacrifice in order to create a better existence for everyone. And what is going to be the cost if we continue to prioritize our own comforts and conveniences and our own beliefs that we now consider to be an extension of us. Because let's not get it twisted. We not only participate in these political processes, but we will celebrate them if the candidate resembles us closely enough. If we consider the candidate to be an accurate reflection of the things we like about ourselves. If we're going to make fundamental transformations, we must also be fundamentally transformed. That means we must also ask ourselves the hard questions. How am I upholding hierarchy? How am I upholding and normalizing human suffering? How am I replicating and reproducing the very aspects of the society that I consider to be a problem? That work is the first step in the infrastructure that we have to build collectively to be ready for the moment to use this opportunity as a catalyst. It won't be fun. It won't necessarily be immediate, but it is absolutely necessary to produce the larger changes we say we want to see. And so because the reality is this, once our leaders, our systems, our social order, our norms and values, once they can justify slaughtering whole populations of people, once they can justify a Hiroshima or an Iraqi invasion under the guise of weapons of mass destruction, once they can do that, how hard do you think it is for them to steal your tax dollars and put them in weapons companies that they get stock kickbacks from instead of giving you free healthcare, instead of giving you free higher education? How hard do you think it is for them? How hard for them do you think it is to saturate your education with propaganda if they slaughter whole populations of people? Once you normalize the level of human suffering that we've seen throughout our history, everything else pales in comparison. Everything else is a diminished harm that you should be grateful for, because you're not being bombed, right? And so the reality is that even though we think that harm is over there, once we allow and normalize that harm over there, we've distorted the moral compass and moral rectitude of the system to such a degree that our own morals are embattled. That now that distorted moral compass is how they judge, how they treat us and service us and what we get, right? That we should be lucky to not be being bombed. So no, don't ask for healthcare. So no, don't ask for, you see what I'm saying? So before we can make the transformations, we have to be a transformation. All right.